Welcome back to Close Up and our extended conversation with Senator Jeanne Shaheen. And Senator, let's turn right back to some questions. You know, if former President Trump wins in November, you're on board for at least another 2 years of serving alongside a second Trump administration. This time around, though, you could be the leading voice on Democratic foreign policy in the Senate, and you're likely to have some profound disagreements with the president. That's going to be a tough assignment, especially the way U.S. foreign policy is traditionally conducted abroad. So how would you see your role articulating what would be a very different vision from a second President Trump on foreign policy?
Well, there's actually been a lot of bipartisan agreement on foreign policy. There was during the Trump years, and I would expect that to happen in a second. If President Trump were to get reelected, I would expect that again, because there is support for NATO, a recognition of how important NATO is in defending our national security here, a recognition that what's very important for the United States is to have friends and allies around the world, and sometimes the rhetoric of former President Trump alienated those friends and allies who we need so much. There was a recognition, a bipartisan recognition of the threat that Russia and China face. President Trump actually raised the concern about the Chinese threat. He seems to admire Vladimir Putin way too much, I believe, but I think the fact that there is bipartisan agreement in Congress about the direction of our foreign policy will have a real impact on the future president.
And Trump is,
whoever that is,
already saying he is going to take a much more expansive view of executive power if he gains the presidency again. Would you try to exercise a more robust foreign policy power within the bounds of the Constitution, even if it means just being more vocal about a establishment position?
Well, the statements of former President Trump about how he views a second term in office are very concerning. Both his saying that if the election, suggesting that if the election doesn't go his way, there's going to be violence in the race. What we saw on January 6th, his efforts to overturn the election of 2020, what he said about being a dictator and going after his enemies, all of that is very troubling in a democracy. That is not the basis of our democracy here in the United States, or any democracy. One of the things that I have done in my travels to some of the former Soviet republics, some of the aspiring democracies, is to talk to the leaders there about why you can't go after your opponents and put them in jail. That's what Donald Trump is talking about. I don't think anybody wants a second term of Donald Trump that does that. So I think and I hope everybody would speak out robustly against that.
The DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee just voted to restore the delegates for the New Hampshire primary, sort of ending the chapter of this saga, which probably was one of the more quote-unquote dangerous versions of this story we see playing itself out over the years when there are threats to the primary. You know, 2028 is going to be a different political landscape no matter what, but I'm not sure if we can just expect things to return to normal. So from your position as the leading Democrat in New Hampshire and a very powerful person in Washington, what are you doing to ensure that that kind of slap in the face that hit New Hampshire in December of 2022 doesn't happen again?
Well, to make it very clear to the DNC why I thought they were wrong. I thought they were wrong when they said they were not going to support New Hampshire being the first primary. I continued to argue that saying that they weren't going to seat our delegates was wrong, and we saw very clearly the importance of the New Hampshire primary and grassroots organizing and why it makes a difference here with the write-in campaign for Joe Biden. I think President Biden was very appreciative of the effort that was made here on his behalf, and I hope the DNC will look at this episode and recognize in 2028 that there is a very important reason why New Hampshire has been the first primary state. It's because we started it. We have this grassroots commitment to understanding what candidates are talking about and what they would stand for, and we examine them very closely, and that has a very important role in the New Hampshire, in the presidential selection process.
Yeah, the turnout speaks for itself, but we'll see how that goes. On the housing front, you've always been a big advocate for energy efficiency, and lately you've been calling for building codes to be updated here in New Hampshire to adopt the 2021 standards. There's been some pushback, though, from the industry side of things. Those folks saying adding those codes would add up to, and this is their figure, an additional $12,000 to $20,000 to a new home. What is your response to that criticism?
Well, the Department of Energy doesn't agree with that. The Department of Energy says that those, the 2021 building codes, if they're adopted, would save homeowners about $500 a year, about $10,000 in net savings over the life of a mortgage, in addition to making homes more comfortable. It saves on utility bills. That's where the $500 savings each month, each year would come from. So I think we're seeing some people who have, from the home builders, because it's the home builders who have been the opponents. They've been an opponent since we first introduced the legislation, Rob Portman and I, in 2011. And we met with them. They said they wouldn't oppose it, and they flipped on us, and they have continued to oppose these efforts. And as we look at our long-term energy needs, it's really short-sighted, because about a third of our energy use is in commercial buildings. It's about 40%. Unless we can save on the use in homes, in commercial buildings, in buildings, not just commercial, we're not going to achieve what we need to on the energy side. And energy efficiency is the cheapest, fastest way to deal with our energy needs. So in the long term, it's going to be in our interest to do this. And we're going to miss out, sadly, on several $1 million that are there to help municipalities, to help organizations like the home builders, to train people on energy efficiency, because the legislature has said they're not going to adopt these energy codes.
It does add, though, to the initial overall cost, though, right? Because you're saying it has to be recouped over time with the energy savings.
It is recouped over time.
But isn't that a barrier, though, I guess, for someone trying to buy a home? It just increases the price.
If you look at most of the responsible developers are already building to standards that are even tighter than the current energy codes, because they understand that long-term this is a good investment, and long-term this is what buyers want as well. If you talk to most buyers, they're looking for windows that are not that are going to withstand cold winters. They're looking for insulation in their homes so that they're more comfortable. They're looking for heats that they can count on. So for developers who are building much of the housing stock in the state, they're already building to those energy codes in ways that we want to try and help everybody do. And again, that's why adopting them is important, because it would bring money back to New Hampshire to help make sure that everybody knows, gets the training and knows what needs to be done in order to build to those codes.
From housing to child care, this is another massive cost for young families right now. What is being done to try and chip away at this astronomical cost that's really crippling a lot of families' home budgets?
Everywhere I've been in the state, and since COVID, there have been three issues: housing, workforce, and child care. And we've got one of the challenges with child care is getting the teachers that we need. I was at Little Blessings in Portsmouth earlier this week, which is a child care center that's operating in a church. They've been there for about 40 years now, and they only have the teachers, the staff they need to accommodate half of the children that they could accommodate if they were able to get the staff, because we're not able to pay. We can't charge families what the real cost is, sadly, because then it's unaffordable. And so we've got to do better. First of all, we need more options. We had a hearing in the Small Business Committee on child care, and one of the things we heard from the experts is we need more options available. So we need family care. Keene State College has got a really interesting pilot program that that we helped to fund, that is looking at how we provide training for people who want to have child care in their homes. We need to figure out how we can provide better wages for child care workers, because we know that what happens in the early years of a child's life is absolutely critical to the rest of their lives.
And really quickly before we wrap up, Senator, do you plan to make an endorsement in this Democratic gubernatorial primary that we're having?
I do not.
Okay.
I think it's important to try and help both candidates. I'm a fan of both Cindy Wormington and Joyce Craig. I've worked very closely with them over the years, and either one of them would be an excellent governor.
All right, Senator, thank you so much for your time here on Close Up, and we'll
Nice
see you
to
out
be
there
with you.
in the Granite State.